Hello, all you little Rowlett readers out there. We are going to be starting a new story today. We have a visitor that's come for the story too. He started coming with Ramona at the end of Ramona, and every time I would read Ramona, he comes running from somewhere in the house to hop up here and read with us. So now, when I pulled the BFG out, he's lingering right at my feet to get picked up because he's kind of older, so we have to lift him up. Right, buddy? His little hips aren't working so great anymore. But our new book we're going to read is by Roald Dahl. It's called the BFG. And when we look at it, I don't have a lot of schema or connections coming at it, but we always want to take time to soak in the cover just to see if anything pops up in our heads, kind of warm our brain up and get ready to read. And then, of course, the good thing is to flip to the blip on the back. This says, captured by a giant. The BFG is no ordinary bone-crunching giant. He's far too nice and jumbly. It's lucky for Sophie that he is. Had she been carried off in the middle of the night by the blood bottler, or flesh lump eater, or bone cruncher, or any of the other giants rather than the BFG, she would have soon become breakfast. When Sophie hears that they're flush blunkling off to England to swallow up a few little chittlers, she decides she must stop them once and for all, and the BFG is going to help her. I'm excited to start this. There are a lot of chapters in the table of contents, but they're very, very short. Each chapter is like 2 pages, so not too long. The first chapter is called The Witching Hour. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam slanted through a gap in the curtains and was shining right on her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried very hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room by her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voices came up from downstairs. There were no footsteps on the floor down above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went by in the street. Not even the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such silence. Perhaps, she told herself, this was why they called it the witching hour. The witching hour, somebody had once whispered to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in a deep, deep sleep, and all the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. Have you ever had that time in the night you wake up in the middle of the night for something? I know, it's a good story. And suddenly, it's so quiet. It's the only time of day when it's that total silence in your house. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of bed and close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were ever caught out of bed after lights out. Even if you said you had to go to the lavatory, that was not accepted as an excuse, and they punished you just the same. And a lavatory is another name for a bathroom, getting up to go to the bathroom. While I'm reading, I want you to make sure that you're activating your movie screen on the inside of your forehead. The thing that good readers do that we know that helps them comprehend better, sorry about my throat, is they can totally picture it and see the scene in their mind. They can envision the images inside their movie screen. Sophie reached out for a glass that lay on the chair beside her. Her glasses, they had steel rims and very thick lenses, and she could hardly see a thing without them. She put them on, then slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. She reached the curtain. Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck underneath them and lean out the window to see what the world looked like now that the witching hour was at hand. She listened again. Everything was deathly still. The longing to look out became so strong she couldn't resist it. Quickly, she ducked under the curtain and leaned out the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well seemed completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked, like houses in a fairy tale. Everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road, she could see Mrs. Rance's shop, where you bought buttons and wool and pieces of elastic. It didn't look real. There was something dim and misty about that, too. Sophie allowed her eyes to travel farther and farther down the street. Suddenly, she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black, tall and black, something very tall and very black and very thin. Chapter 2. Who? It wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall that its head was higher than the upstairs windows of her house. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound would come out. Her throat and her whole body was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the houses across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. On and on it came, nearer and nearer, but it was moving in spurts. It would stop, then it would move on, and then it would stop again. What on earth was it doing? Aha! Sophie could see what it was up to. It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop and peer into the upstairs window of each house. On the street, it actually had to bend down to peer in the upstairs window. That's how tall it was. It would stop, peer in, then it would slide onto the next house, stop, peer in, and so on, all the way down the street. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it clearly. Looking at it carefully, she decided it had to be some kind of a person. Obviously, it was not a human, but it was definitely a person. A giant person, perhaps. Sophie stared hard across the misty moonlit street. The giant, if that's what he was wearing a long black cloak. Okay, start doing your images on your screen. A cloak is another name for a coat. A long black coat. Sophie stared hard across the misty moonlit street. In one hand, he was holding what looked like a very long, thin trumpet. In the other hand, he had a very large suitcase. The giant had stopped now right in front of Mr. and Mrs. Maguchi's house. The Gucci's had the green grocer shop in the middle of High Street, and the family lived up above the shop. The 2 Gucci children slept in the upstairs front room. Sophie knew that. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gucci were sleeping. From across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back a pace, put the suitcase down on the pavement. He bent over and opened the suitcase and took something out of it. It looked like a glass jar, one of those square ones with a screw on top. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was in it into the long end of the trumpet. Sophie watched, trembling. She saw the giant straighten up again. She saw him poke the trumpet through the upstairs window of the rooms where the Gucci children were sleeping. She saw the giant take a deep breath and whoosh, he blew through his trumpet. No noise came out, but it was obvious to Sophie that whatever had been in the jar had now blown through the trumpet and right into the Gucci children's bedroom. What could it be? Now, kids who are, well, they don't pay attention to what good readers do. They just read the words. They just keep reading. Sounds good. But they don't stop to go, ooh, turn on my movie screen in my head. When you do that, it changes everything. The best thing about a read aloud is that when Mrs. Kolbe's reading, you can just drift away into your head and your imagination and make all the pictures that you've seen. That's why it's always good to read a book before you watch the movie. Because sometimes they put things in the movie and I go, oh, that's not at all like I pictured it in my head. So you got your movie screens activated? Good. What could it be that blew in their window? As the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window, he bent down to pick up the suitcase. He happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse, okay, get this pictured in your mind, of an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face with the most enormous ears. The nose was sharp as a knife, and above the nose were 2 bright, flashing eyes, and the eyes were staring straight at Sophie. There was a fierce and devilish look about him. Sophie gave a "ooh" and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under her blanket. And there she crouched, still as a mouse, tingling all over. The next chapter is called The Snatch. And the chapters don't have a number on them, so I'm just going to say the next chapter instead of chapter 3. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. Have you ever gotten under your blankets before because you hear a noise in the night like, eek? After a minute or so, she lifted a corner of the blanket to peep out. For the second time that night, her blood froze into ice and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the most enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of a giant person staring in. The flashing eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking through the window. This was followed by an arm that was thick as a tree trunk. The arm, the hand, and the fingers were reaching across the room toward Sophie's bed. This time, Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped over her blanket and the scream was smothered by her bedclothes. Sophie was crouching underneath the blanket. She felt strong fingers grasping a hold of her, and then she was lifted up out of her bed, blanket and all, and whisked right out the window. Well, if you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, then let's hear about it. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that a monster, or a giant with an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes had plucked her out of her bed in the middle of the witching hour and was carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so he could grasp all 4 corners of it at once in his huge hand. Sophie was imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing ran off. Sophie was squirming around inside the blanket, but she managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down High Street. He was running so fast that his black cloak was streaming out behind him, just like the wings of a bird. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. So when he's running, it's like 1 tennis court, 2 tennis courts. That is long. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem for the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it in one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being bumped against the giant's leg like a sack of potatoes. Over the field and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while, a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running so fast, she told herself, because he's hungry, and he wants to get home as quickly as possible and then have me for breakfast. Eek. Uh-oh, page turn. This chapter is called The Cave, and this is another one that just, this whole book, just to get those images on the inside of your forehead. He does such a brilliant job putting description in his passages that let you stop for a minute and just picture where you are. Well, the giant ran on, but now a curious change took place in the way of his running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks and made her eyes water. She whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. It whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation that they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were on land or over the sea. The giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down into the blanket again to protect her head from being blown off. Was it really possible that they were crossing over oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then all at once, the wind stopped howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked up her head out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use to describe his galloping. He leaped over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest and then down into a valley, up over a range of hills as bare as concrete, and soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. Desolate means empty, sparse, nothing's on it. Okay, listen to this, get a picture. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rocks were scattered around. Dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie was still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it in the sky it was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying around delicately like frosty white flakes of a cloud. And over to one side, the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out as he paused to catch his breath. Here's another great part to begin to picture in your mind. Directly in front of him, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it was a football. And now where the stone had been, there was a vast black hole. The hole was so large that the giant didn't even have to duck his head when he went in. So that is big, bigger than a 2-story house. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place, so the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from the outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not even a glint of light inside the cave. Everything was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away, and Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. He's getting ready to eat me, she told herself. He'll probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he'll boil me first. Or maybe he'll have me fried. He will drop me like a little rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat. A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked her eyes and stared around. She saw an enormous cavern, which is like a big empty cave, with a high rocky roof. Can you picture it inside there? The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and the shelves there stood in row upon row of glass jars. So the whole cave is covered with these shelves and glass jars. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor, there was a table, 12 feet high to match. Now in your house, that's taller than your ceiling. So that is a big, tall table he sits at. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing sort of a collarless shirt, a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded and green and were far too short for his legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toe stuck out. Sophie was crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie. She gazed back at him through her thick, steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. So, Sophie is still in her nightgown because he plucked her right out of her bed. And don't worry if you think this sounds like too scary of a story to listen to. It isn't. It's just the beginning that kind of is like creepy because that's where he gets her from. So, keep listening. It's a really wonderful story. I hope that you worked on activating your movie screen inside your forehead. If you didn't know you have one, you got to turn it on, because even while you're looking at me reading, you can see a picture on the inside of your forehead of what's going on. It's the weirdest thing I've ever heard of, that you can be seeing me and watching that at the same time, but you can. You can be looking down at the words on your page and still have this movie going. So anyway, we're going to stop there for today. I'm so glad you came to read with me. I hope you're enjoying the start of the BFG, and we'll keep reading a little bit each day. So I'll see you tomorrow, where we'll learn more about Sophie and the BFG. See you later. Bye.